Now I would like to introduce my favorite photographer, Tom Donahoe, who will tell you about tonight's program.
I'm afraid to touch this now. Please, at this point, if you have any electronic devices still turned on, please turn them off. And also, Mary will be available after her program to sign books in the lobby out here. And you know, I am so pleased tonight to be able to introduce Mary Alinder. I got to know Mary and her photographer husband Jim in the late 80s, when some Ansel Adams projects brought us together, most notably the 1987 exhibit at the DeYoung Museum, which Mary curated and which she refers to as a blockbuster, which it certainly was. But, you know, 24 years have gone by, and now her new book, Group f.64, has provided us an occasion to reconnect. Mary and Jim were first introduced to members of Group f.64 in 1967 at a photography workshop in Oregon. And in 1979, she became Ansel Adams' chief assistant, remaining so until his death in 1985. She had been working with Ansel on his autobiography and completed it after his death. And that book was soon followed by Ansel Adams, Letters and Images, which she co-edited, and her Ansel Adams biography was published in 1996, and a revised edition came out last year concurrently with Group 64. As a scholar specializing in the history of photography, Mary has curated exhibitions and lectured worldwide, and she has been a visiting scholar at the universities of Texas and Nebraska and has taught at Stanford University. You know, photography has dramatically changed since the 1930s, and I don't know what the Group f.64s would think about the casual ubiquity of photography these days. But here's a quote from Ansel Adams that Mary includes in her book. And he says, "As to aesthetic considerations, a photograph that is merely a superficial record of the subject fails as an aesthetic expression of that subject. The expression must be an emotional amplification, and this emotional amplification relates to point of view, organization, revelation of substance through textures, tonal relations, and the perfection of the technical expression of all these elements." I think, you know, that statement still applies to photography as an art, no matter how you make your photographs these days. And Ansel, you know, Ansel's words just still have meaning. And Mary tells the story of how a group of photographers evolved into artists, and in doing so, elevated photography itself into an art. And we are so pleased to have Mary here this evening to tell us that story. Mary Alinder. There.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here in Walnut Creek, and it's wonderful to be back with Tom. The last portfolio of Ansel's life was called the Museum Set. And to make a very long story short, Tom was head of the foundation that purchased one of Ansel's museum sets. And unfortunately, Ansel died before that foundation could do what they were going to do. But what was wonderful about what Tom's leadership did is the whole purpose was to get Ansel's photographs out into museums and traveling shows and eventually into a nonprofit. And Ansel would have been so proud. It's exactly what Tom did. That museum set that he was in charge of, yes, we used it as the core of the Big DeYoung show, but it also was a monumental show at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., traveled all over the United States, and that's exactly what Ansel had hoped for. So I'm always have great gratitude and respect for you. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you the story of Group F.64. You can read the book, and I would suggest you do that. But so what we're going to do tonight is it's going to be a very personal story, and I'm just going to be talking with you about the whole process. Pardon?
Turn your microphone on here.
Oh, okay. Yay. So, does that look really bleached out, or is it just me on that screen? Yeah. Is there any way to deal with that? Because I'm afraid images are going to be that way.
That blind needs to come down.
Oh, that blind?
Here we go.
Okay. Anyway, my new book is on Group F.64. Who were Group F.64? It was a bunch of Bay Area photographers, an unusual bunch. Many of them became some of the greatest artists of the 20th century, that came together in 1932 in the depths of the Depression and swore that they would band together and fight for the establishment and recognition of photography as a creative art. This whole story begins with Jim, my husband, who's in the back. We met in 1965 in the Somali Republic, courtesy of the Peace Corps. We met in June and we got married in December. And on our very first date, literally, we talked all night and we knew there was a big connection. And he said the next time, he gave me 3 books. And he said, if we're going to go further with this relationship, you need to read these 3 books. And it was Ansel Adams, Paul Strand, and an Edward Weston. He had gone into the Peace Corps to try to live his dreams of becoming a photographer rather than his parents' dreams of being a doctor or a lawyer. And so he was the advisor to the Ministry of Information in Somalia and produced its first and maybe last tourist brochure. Anyway, this is one of his wonderful photographs from that time, Somali mother and child. So we went, after we got married and we finished our time in Somalia, we moved to the University of New Mexico, where he was going to get an MFA in photography, and I was an English major. Whoops, I'll get there. And the summer of '67, Jim, as Tom mentioned, signed us up for a 2-week workshop, photography workshop at University of Oregon, and it was called Group F.64. And it was led and taught by some of these great photographers who back so many years earlier had been worked together and showed together and fought together for photography. And the photographs I'm going to be showing you are pictures Jim made of these photographers in '67. This is Imogen Cunningham. This is when we first met her. She was extraordinary. She was feisty and opinionated, and she rode around. She had a student drive her around in a VW bus. She was hippier than we were, and we were hippie. She wore granny dresses, and the difference between her granny dress and mine was hers was ironed, you know. But that began a friendship to the end of her life. This is Ansel at the same workshop. Ansel, when we first met him, just seemed, in our minds, he was the fat cat of photography. He was too successful. He must be filthy rich. We didn't have a lot that we felt in common with him. And he did tend to pontificate, which endeared us all the more to Imogen because she loved, bursting his balloon. I mean, whenever she would say, "Oh, Ansel, it wasn't like that." Yeah. Another photographer that was taught us at Oregon was Willard Van Dyke. He and Ansel were the two young Turks of Group F.64. Their energy and their aesthetics worked together, and they were two of the younger members of the group. Willard in '67 was the first director and was director of the first Department of Cinema Film at Museum of Modern Art in New York. What had happened is, as the 30s progressed, he moved from being a student of an acolyte of Edward Weston to deciding that photography, still photography, wasn't where it was at, that it would be more effective. He wanted to make social change more effective as a cinematographer, and he became one of the strongest cinematographers in the United States in the late 30s and 40s. It's interesting because the time we spent with him in '67, he had become quite a bitter man. Even though he achieved so much, he had seen what happened with Ansel, which is incredible, and Imogen, and how famous all of that. And I think what he ended up telling us students was that he'd made a huge mistake back there in 1935-36, that he decided that when you made a film and it's up on the screen, it's evanescent, and people sit and watch it and then they walk out. But that with a still photograph, it had greater lasting power. People could have it on their walls or in the book, and they could look at it over and over again. Okay, so we had to go with what Jim could find as far as the pictures from back in '67. And the only picture we could find of Brett Weston, Edward's son, who was an original member along with Edward, was under a dark cloth. And Brett was something else. He asked me one day if I would run away with him to the Greek Isles. And I looked at him and I absolutely said no. But his heart was so broken that by nightfall, he had another woman ready to go. Oh, well, this is the only picture Jim can find of me. And so when he brought it to me when I was, structuring this workshop, I said, I'm not showing. He says, it's art. I said, I don't care, I'm not showing that. I said, well, if you put black bands, and it took him like 4 tries before the bands were big enough for me. So we went back to New Mexico, and on the wall of the museum at the university, in permanent exhibition was Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico by Ansel. And every time it stopped me, I couldn't walk just past it. It demanded my attention. So I decided, I should find out more about Ansel Adams rather than just write him off. And when I did my research, I found that he was exactly the artist that meant the most to me. He was an artist who was very involved in his times. He was a strong, responsible citizen. He was deeply involved in the environmental movement. He served on the board of the Sierra Club from 1934 to 1971. And as I looked at more and more of his work, I fell in love with the work as well. So Ansel all of a sudden came on our radar screen. Why we moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, I don't think I said, is that Jim became, that was his first job after the MFA. He was first assistant and then associate professor at that university. And we had a great time there, and they gave him wonderful support. It was a great place to start having a family. But then in 1977, Jim got a phone call from Ansel, and he said, would you consider moving to Carmel and direct my nonprofit, Friends of Photography? And Jim kind of looked at me, and we're thinking like, Nebraska, Carmel. Love Nebraska, but Carmel. So we moved immediately at this point we had 3 kids, to Carmel. And I'd had a very kind of checkered educational past. I had edited the graduate and undergraduate literary magazine at New Mexico. My degree was in English, and but I also got very involved in natural childbirth and started the first Lamaze classes and taught like 10,000 people. My group did. We started a whole big group over many, many years, and I personally taught like 1,200. But anyway, so I decided to go back to become a nurse midwife. When we moved to Carmel, I was the English major, knew a lot about photography, and I also was an RN. And so anyway, it was 2 years later that Ansel asked me to direct his staff and to make him write his autobiography, but he secretly loved it that I was an RN because he had pretty fragile health, and I was with him whenever we went to the hospital. He went to the hospital, I was with him. And the doctors all let me come into every procedure and every room, and it really made Ansel feel confident, and I was able to be with him when he died. But anyway, these are the years that he's really reaching supreme popular. He was on the cover of Time, which he's a humble guy, but he was thrilled. So when I started to work for Ansel, my first real job, first it was quality control of prints. What prints he was printing were good enough, and that's another story, because that was quite an education, is he teaching me. But was to make him write his autobiography. So I knew one of the central parts of that had to be Group F.64, because there's never been a book on it. There needed to be a lot more information. So in 1983, I was working out all the way through, but in 83 I was able to get Ansel on the left, Willard Van Dyke in the middle, and the great historian, Beaumont Newhall, who wrote The History of Photography, together to and interview them about F.64. And what I found was that one would remember one thing, another, one would dispute what somebody else said. And it was very interesting, but I also knew that made me know I would have to go a lot deeper to find out what happened. So Ansel died on April 22nd, 1984, and it was a shock. But we were under deadline for his autobiography, and he died in April, and it came out a year the next September. So I spent a huge amount of time, obviously almost all my time, on this book. I always thought that one of the reasons it became a New York Times bestseller was it had such an engaging cover. And that picture was made by Jim. Ansel always believed in 7 days of work. He didn't believe in days off. And he would knock on our door like on Saturday mornings sometimes and literally say, "Can Jim come out to play?" Because they loved going out photographing together. And Jim could help Ansel with some of the equipment, and they would share lenses. Well, really, it was Ansel's lenses. He would share them with Jim. And that was just on our, on a foggy day on our back deck. And that was followed by the book of letters Tom mentioned that I co-edited. So in 1978, there was the first museum exhibition on F.64 with a museum catalog. And then in 1992, the Oakland Museum presented a big show. It was a beautiful show called the Group F.64 Revolution, Seen Straight. And this is the museum catalog. I was one of 3 authors of this catalog. And I knew then I just had to write a book on F.64. But first I had to do my own biography of Ansel, and that took me a number of years to come to grips with my relationship. The autobiography, Ansel was like he was on my shoulder the whole time. I knew his voice, I knew what he wanted. I went through all 40,000 negatives. We had just finished proofing them for the first time for the 250 reproductions in the autobiography, and I knew what Ansel wanted. But when it comes from my own voice and my own perception, it took me a while to wrestle with that. And it just came out, this is a brand new, as far as fully revised and updated version. That last one was with Jim's photograph of Ansel on the cover, and it's a color photograph, and I wanted color on the cover, but my publisher, who was Henry Holt, they said, Ansel Adams in color? No, it has to be black and white. And so this is a portrait of Ansel by Imogen. So finally my own book came out last November, and so what I want to talk about is the basis of why f.64 happened. When photography was first given freely to the world in 1839 by the French government, it was the announcement of the process of the daguerreotype. Shortly after that, in England, Henry Fox Talbot began producing photographs made from paper negatives. Daguerreotypes were singular, one of a kind, and you had to look at them, as you know, in glancing light, but they had exquisite detail. And the Talbots could be reproduced using the paper negatives, but you know what happens with paper negative. It's partly, it's not that transparent, so the pictures were fuzzier. But right from the beginning, the intent, there were artists or photographers with the intent to make a creative image, to make art. The problem arose that more people criticized photography for being incapable of being an art because it was made by a machine, the camera. So photography was getting no respect, very little respect. It was never shown in museums. At the turn of the century, that's 19th and 20th, photographers decided, you know what if we make our photographs look like already established art, like charcoal drawings, pastels, etchings. If we use soft focus and manipulate the image so that people look at it and they think, well, it looks like a legitimate art. So these were called the pictorialists, and this was the dominant style from the end of the 19th century well into the 20th. This is Edward Steichen, 1905, Mary and her mother. This is Annie Brigman, 1907, a California pictorialist of note who began working in Oakland, lived there for quite a while, and before moving south to Southern California. You can see again, it looks more like a charcoal than a photograph. They're putting on matte, usually textured, warm papers. And one of the things the pictorialists like to do was to assure how important their image is to link it or illustrate some great piece of history or philosophy, or in this case, you know, the nymph inside the tree reaching, beyond the world. This is John Paul Edwards, who was a hobbyist, but very dedicated, and lived in the East Bay, worked in San Francisco, and he was a very well-known amateur pictorialist. Again, this is his daughter sitting with trees in Carmel. At the same time, at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, Alfred Stieglitz is working in New York. You probably know of Stieglitz because, for one thing, he was married to George O'Keeffe. But Stieglitz was one of the great photographers ever, of any time or any age. He began at the turn of the century moving from pictorialism into, he would go out into the streets of New York and photograph in all kinds of weather, which was thought impossible but for photographers. He used sharp focus, and he became the tastemaker, the mover and shaker of not just photography, but of fine art, not just in New York. His influence spread around the world. So if he anointed you as an artist, he had a series of galleries he would show work in, then you were brought to the attention of the world. The thing is, he was, even though he's practicing a form of straight photography, definitely, he is an elitist, and he mostly cares to communicate with wealthy people, not the hoi polloi of photographers, and almost no photographer is good enough for him. He discovers and brings out and shows the work of Paul Strand, but until you get into the 1930s, he only literally shows himself and Strand. Nobody is good enough, and nobody gets to see him. This is one of his greatest photographs. This is the steerage, 1907. He is sailing from New York to Europe, and he's in first class, and he looks down into steerage and sees this composition, which is a very formal composition, but dynamic, with that spar thrusting right through the image. Socially, it is very interesting because who these people are, these are failed immigrants. These are people who have come to the United States and not made it and are being shipped back home. He focused on, if you can see towards the top, the man in the white straw hat. That was for him, what made him make this photograph. That was the focus, and everything else moved around it. More pictorialism that's continuing. This is I think it's 12 or 14. This is Imogen Cunningham illustrating the wind. So who's working in California through much of the early 20s is, in Southern California, Edward Weston. He had a studio down in Glendale or Tropico, and eventually moved up to Carmel in 1929. He, in 1920 or 22, I'm sorry, I've been having such a good time talking to you. In 1921, this is a photograph of him by his mistress, his lover, his equal, Margaret Mather, who was also a photographer. I've got to tell you, Edward, like his son Brett, was known to enjoy women's company immensely, and not necessarily a single woman at a time. And most of the women that, if you read about him photographing, making their portraits, will say that they fell in love with his warm brown eyes. And I saw this photograph that Margaret made of him, and I just, it lets you know. And I understood a lot more about Edward and his eyes. Anyway, so Edward goes in 1922 to show his work to Stiglitz. And this is the kind of work, he's getting a lot of exhibitions in salons. He's a medal winner, he has a studio, he takes people's portraits, he's very well regarded in the West. And this is 1919, that is a portrait of Margaret Mather. And you can see it's soft and definitely pictorialist, but it's also lovely. It's a lovely, lovely picture. On his way across the country, his train, he gets off and he stops and photographs Armco Steel. This is 1922. And look at the change of his imagery. All of a sudden, he has moved aesthetically from this romantic view of the world to the world as it is. And he's concerned at this point. I can tell you, no one was photographing factories in 1922. You often think of it, but it was Charles Sheeler who became very well known for his River Rouge plant photographs, but he doesn't do that until 1927. So Edward is very early in this. He brings his work to Stiglitz in New York, and shows Stiglitz all of his work, including this. And Stiglitz is pretty much just puts him down totally. He said, now let me show you my photographs. And then he would say to Edward, he pontificated for 2.5 hours, that he, see how much better my skin is in the photograph I made of her than yours, and on and on. Well, Edward was just kind of like shot down, but he instead, rather than being a negative, he decided he knew what he was going to do, and he was going to go forward and forget about Stiglitz. He never really did forget about Stiglitz, but Stiglitz just did not give him any respect. When Imogen Cunningham went to see Stiglitz, she got no respect. So he returns to the Bay Area, and as I said, 1929 to Carmel. So he's got a lot going on. Imogen's got a lot going on. There are lots of photographers working, and in 1930, this man, without him, none of this might have happened. This is Lloyd LePage Rollins, and he's hired to become the director of the Legion of Fine Arts in San Francisco. And a few months later, he adds the DeYoung. So he's director of all of it. He is a guy that he's out in the streets talking to people about the museums. Do you know where they are? What's happening? He goes to artist studios and meets with photographers, and he becomes very excited about what's happening in photography in the Bay Area, and begins in 1930 exhibiting major exhibitions, solo exhibitions of photographers at the DeYoung. And they include, in the next couple of years, Edward Weston, Imogen, Margaret Mather, Brett Weston, Ansel Adams. He was a phenomenal director. And I think because of all of his exhibitions, photography finally needed a photography critic. The first photography critic I've really been able to find that's all they're doing. They're not they're not critics of theater and photography or paintings, and just photography. And who was that first critic? If you look down there on the right, if you can read it, it's Ansel Adams. Ansel becomes the critic of a short-lived arts magazine called The Fortnightly, and comes on every photographer's radar at that point, because he's reviewing Edward, he's reviewing these different people. And before that, Ansel, his experience in photography was with the Sierra Club, going out hiking, and that's where he sold his work to other Sierra Club members. But all of a sudden, he is now coming to the attention of the much larger art community of San Francisco and the East Bay. So there was San Francisco, because of Lloyd Rollins and because of all these great young people photographing, had become a hotbed. And the photographers used to party together, and they decided that they should band together. They would be stronger as a group rather than as individuals to fight the good fight. And besides so they were trying to get Stiglitz's attention, and he was ignoring them. Not through this. This is William Mortensen. The other thing that they were pushing back against or rebelling is that pictorialism had, may I say, devolved, and the people, the most vocal pictorialist of the day was a Southern Californian named William Mortensen. And he, again, he's staging important historical events like pictorialists did. But most of them they were soft porn. They used a lot of naked women doing different things. And to Ansel, he was Satan. Let's see. So this is Willard back in 1932. It's by Edward Weston. And so Willard had a girlfriend, and she was John Paul Edwards, who I mentioned earlier, his daughter, Mary Jeanette. They were both photographers. They were students at University of California, Berkeley. Willard was going back and forth studying with Edward in Carmel, and they had taken, when Annie Brigman left the Bay Area, moved to Southern California, she rented, this is a small incestuous world, rented her barn studio in Oakland to Willard and Mary Jeanette, and it became their clubhouse. They both slept at home. It was very, very proper. And in fact, when John Paul visited for the first time and saw there was one bed in a room, he wouldn't leave until that bed was out of there. So anyway, this was their place to hang out and to have friends over, and they had a dark room that people would share, and people would have parties and share and look at photographs and put them up. Willard always said that the key to his parties was his 4-star punch, because what it did, it guaranteed that if you drank it when you woke up in the morning, you would be seeing stars. And what he used, it was time of prohibition, so what he used was the alcohol they used to clean their negatives, and because they could get that. So this was his secret. He would take a whole bunch of that alcohol, squeeze a lot of lemons into it, and a lot of sugar, and then, as he said, a dollop of glycerin to smooth out the ride. So he invites all his friends for a party on October 15th, 1932. Mary Jeanette, while he has great aspirations as an artist, Mary Jeanette is a studio photographer, takes pictures of children and never really progresses much beyond that. This is Willard's photograph of Hands of a Boxer. And this is what he's doing in 1932, amongst many other things. Very close, everyday subject matter, great depth of field. That means focus from the beginning of the front of the image through every picture plane. And believe me, I don't think that that's being translated there, but great definition and sharpness. And another thing it shows you is when you go through the archives of all these photographers, especially in 1932, they all have pictures of hands, because Lloyd LePage Rollins sponsored two shows, competitive shows in 1932, and one was it's called a Showing of Hands, a big exhibition. I'm sure that Willard did the hands for that exhibition. Okay, so also invited to the party is John Paul, and he, I think I have a picture next to one of his. He is beginning to work. He's been a pictorialist, but he's found the straight and true path now, and probably through Willard, through Mary Jeanette. And this is mooring cables at the time. Again, everyday subject matter, great depth of field, great display of tonality, and very crisp and sharp. Also at the party that night was Edward, and Willard went down, and Edward didn't drive, and picked Edward up and his girlfriend Sonia Noskoviak. It is a huge time for Edward. His first book is going to be published in the next month, and I like to think that he brought proofs, page proofs, and shared them with everybody that night, and which would be very exciting, because it was literally his was one of the very first monographs or photography books on by one photographer. This is 1927. This is Nautilus Shell. This is one of his great masterpieces. So you can see how much he's come from the Margaret Mather soft focus through the factory picture, and now the Nautilus Shell, which is an extraordinary image. His girlfriend is Sonia Noskoviak, and she has been living with him since right after he got to Carmel, 1929. She is a photographer. She began with him. He taught her how to spot his prints which she loved him very much to do that, I can tell you. I love my husband, but I said no after about the first 2 times. But most photographers tried to fob off the spotting on somebody else. And she became a really fine photographer. This is, to me, very interesting. She often would go, they were primarily vegetarians, and mostly because they couldn't afford meat. But she would go out and gather subject matter for his camera. And this is the white radish, and they both photographed it. The one on the right is Sonia's, and the one on the left is Edward's. And it takes a while to see the differences, but Edward's is so much more spare because, as you can see, literally there's no detail in the background, and she does have the detail in the background. And they just, how they positioned the radish and turned it speaks, I think, volumes. I think hers is beautiful. I think his is more. So also at the party is Imogen Cunningham. And Imogen is the most successful commercial photographer in the whole batch. She is on staff with Vanity Fair, and she makes a whole series of portraits for different articles for them. So she is looked at as being, you know, she has achieved it, and she was the model, big model for all the younger people, and all the women looked to her for support and advice. This is her double exposure of Martha Graham. Imogen has never gotten the credit that I think she's due for how pioneering she was in photography, and I speak quite a bit about that in the book. She was doing close-ups of flowers before literally anybody, and working with different processes, negative, positive, double exposures. This is Henry Swift. He probably was not at the party, but they elected him to be a member of the group they were forming. He was a banker, a stockbroker, and had his own investment agency in San Francisco. He was a student of Edward's, and Imogen years later said, oh, the only reason we included him was because we hoped he would buy our photographs like he bought Edward's. But you'll see by the evidences that he was a very fine photographer too. This is his photograph for the hand show. And Ansel was there. He was now part of the group and included in everything. I always think of this photograph as that teacup is probably holding the punch in Prohibition. And he's probably thinking about his trip home, because everybody in this group at this point lives in the East Bay, except for Ansel lives in San Francisco, and he's got to take the ferry back. Ansel's big breakthrough was 1927 with the making of Monolith, The Face of Half Dome. It's a famous story, I know you've heard it, but it was on that day that Ansel had 2 glass plates left. He was using an old camera. That's all he could afford, and had hiked up to this spot near the diving board in Yosemite to photograph Half Dome, made one exposure and stopped and said, you know what, I know I got the photograph to look like what it looks like, but it will never communicate in the final print what I feel like. And he placed a dark red filter over the lens, and all of a sudden the pale daylight sky became this dark, brooding image, and it really increased the contrast on Half Dome of the stone, more blacks, more whites. And it was that day that Ansel moved from being a craftsman into understanding that photography for him, he had to be seen and interpreted through his heart, his soul. And he called that visualization. He had to know what the final print would look before he even exposed the negative. So they decide that they're going to go out there together, and they decide on the name Group f.64, which stands for a very small aperture opening in a view camera lens. Very small, but what it does, if you have a small enough opening with a long enough exposure, you're going to get the sharpest image, the greatest depth of field, but it has to have a long exposure usually. I will tell you, it was a symbolic thing for them to say, and very few of them ever made any photographs with f.64. Like all those ones of Ansel's that I've been through, I think I found like 3 or 4 negatives out of 40,000. So it was symbolic more than anything else. But it also included everyday subject matter, and this is Imogen's Magnolia, Tower of Jewels. It's the heart of the magnolia blossom. So they decided they need to have an exhibition, and Ansel went and made an appointment with, the party was on Saturday night. He made an appointment and he saw Lloyd LePage Rollins on either Monday or Tuesday. And Rollins said, you have to have the exhibition here. It would be, you know, a stab in my back if you took it some other place. Please have it here. And so we're talking about the 17th probably, or 18th of October. He offered him an exhibition for opening November 15th, which in today's museum world would never happen. And so Ansel, because he had the pep of youth, and decided, of course, they could pull a show together. And they decided to do, it would be 64 prints. And this is the invitation. It's not, it was made on just an 8.5 by 11 white sheet of paper and printed, and then would be folded into fours. And you can see the original 7 members on the right, and they decided to invite 4 younger people who are, for the most part, younger, who aren't quite as established, to encourage their work. And that was all part of what they decided to do. So one of the people they invited was Alma Lavinson, who lived in Oakland. She was a very proper young lady, and had been, she was a self-confessed hobbyist. She never her whole life said she was a professional photographer, but she had been very successful. She had been in a number of magazines and won a number of competitions. And in fact, in 1932, the second show that Lloyd Rollins hosted was one called California Trees. Edward won first prize, but Alma won second prize. Edward's son, Brett, was invited. He had he'd had a solo show, or was coming up at the DeYoung. He was pretty incredible achievement. He was born in 1910, so at this point he's 21, 22 years old. This is Brett's from 1932, Sand Dune. I think we all know, most of us know, Edward's great sand dune pictures of Oceana in 1935-36. This is Brett earlier than Edward. Brett's someone who got his father to start using glossy papers and get away from the pictorialist matte papers. But I think this is just an extraordinary image, literally a complete abstract, and it's concerned with texture, form, incredible detail in every grain of sand you can see. The third person invited was Connie Consuelo, or Connie Kanaga. She was respected as a newswoman and as a photographer, a woman who went places no woman had ever gone. She would go into, well, one of the things she was famous for is when they were doing the longshoremen's strikes in 1934, which is a little past 32, but she'd been doing things like this earlier. She took her view camera and set up her tripod in the communist newspaper's office, which she'd already heard that the shippers were going to come and destroy the office. And she photographed there with like clubs flying and everything else. She had become known as, in her earlier days in the 20s, as literally an ambulance chaser. She photographed where women had not photographed before. So she was quite a trendsetter. She also would photograph and work 5 days a week, and her whole life she kept 2 days free for her own work. And her own work for most of her life was photographing the unseen Americans, which were Black Americans. And she made a whole series of great images of Black Americans. And at the time, people did not photograph Black Americans, African Americans. If they did, it would be always like looking down or placing them in a roll. And she photographed either straight on or from below, looking up with great, emphasizing the great dignity of both. Believe me, I mean, from here I'm worried about the detail, but it's an exquisite print. She was a great printer. You don't know until you see her prints in person, and there aren't many of them. And the fourth was Preston Holder. This is he was a close friend of Willard's. They both went to school at Berkeley, and Willard started bringing him down to work with Edward. This is a portrait of Preston by Edward, 31 or 32. He's exhausted and laying down at Point Lobos where they were photographing and just taking in the sun. No one knew anything about Preston. One of the great gifts that Nebraska gave us is it turned out that the chairman of the anthropology department was Preston Holder. And Jim knew enough to recognize the name, and he did the only big interview and did like a small book on Preston, all about F.64, thank goodness. I was taking anthropology at that point, and I remember I had to go into his office the first time I met Preston and ask his permission to take a class because I was pregnant. And at that time, University of Nebraska, if a woman was pregnant, you had to have the permission of the chairman of the department. Preston became a very close friend of ours. And this is one of Preston's smokestacks and gears. He worked very closely with Willard, and when Willard ended up going off to New York, Preston went on and did not really photograph anymore. He became known as much as anything as a poet photographer, and I think that's one of the reasons they decided he was good enough, was that he would write a poem to accompany the photographs. It was a different way of approaching things. The women, one of the things that drew me to F.64 was I knew that the women were in on it from the ground floor and helped form the whole association, the aesthetic, the exhibitions, everything. And it is the first art movement I have found where women are on the ground floor in the beginning as equal members. And these three continued to photograph together their whole lives. This is in the 50s. That's Imogen on the left, and Connie on the right, and Alma in the middle. Edward and Sonia, their relationship became rocky. And Edward, who never felt he could, he was married for many, many years, would ever find a woman that was just enough for him. He needed women to fire his creativity. This is what he always said. But he met a very young woman, I think she was 18 at the time, Karis Wilson, and in 1934, and fell deeply and madly in love with her. To me, this shows a great deal of what's going on in this relationship, in these relationships on the left. That is his portrait, his nude of Sonia, and on the right is Karis. All of the love is on the right, and Sonia doesn't have much love coming towards her from his camera. So they split up, and Sonia continues to photograph most of her life as a commercial photographer. This is their manifesto. They decided they had to write their philosophy, and in fact, Lloyd Rollins did pin it or tack it to the museum exhibition wall in the great style of manifestos. And it's interesting, I think it was pretty much written by a combination of Ansel and Willard, but it must have been ratified by the group. And it just explains that the name of this group is derived from the diaphragm number of the photographic lens. It signifies to a large extent the qualities of clearness and definition of the photographic image, which is an important element in the work of the members of this group. And it goes on from that. So Mortensen continues to batter at their ramparts. This is his self-portrait. And anyway, he begins a whole series of articles in Cameracraft magazine about pictorialism. He was a wonderful writer, a lot of fun. But his pictures were pretty, well, this is, to me, this is his masterpiece. This is really, and if this doesn't go any further, I own a copy, I own one of these. I'm not kidding. When Ansel's big show, Ansel Adams in the West, opened at the Oakland Museum in 1979, we get to the exhibition opening, and there's a big sign. On the second floor is a Mortensen retrospective. And Ansel turned around to leave. He wouldn't go through the door. And it took everything I could to get him through that door and forget about it. This is called Human Relations 1932. And what it is it's the corporate, big, greedy business gouging out the eyes of the common man. Just to let you know, Mortensen began as a set designer for Cecil B. DeMille. And so he would actually construct the sets. So you're not looking at manipulation as far as, these are actual people that he dresses up and does these things to. So after their exhibition, which didn't cause much notice, the biggest notice for the arts was there was a big horse show about horses, including like Walt Disney horses and things. That took most of the critics and everything. But after the original exhibition at the De Young, Willard and Mary Jeanette decide to open a gallery at their old barn, and they call it 383 Brockhurst for the address. They had a whole series of exhibitions. This shows you the solo exhibition they did of Edward. Their first exhibition was Group F.64. They called it Western Photographers because Mary Jeanette showed in it, and the others wouldn't accept her as being good enough. This is 683 Brockhurst today. The barn was torn down and made into a stucco cottage. And Ansel opened an exhibition, the Ansel Adams Gallery, opened a gallery, and his first show was photographs by Group F.64, and you will see that Connie Kanaga is now a full member. This is the Ansel Adams Gallery today. It's above Jimmy Choo's shoes. That's Jimmy on the right. And up above, there was a tailor, and now it's been closed, but and that was the entry. And what's cool is just go in that door. There are 2 old birdcage elevators, and just to ride up them and know that all these great people rode up to Ansel's gallery, and it is, to me, it got me. It was a charge. Ansel only lasted. He opened in September 1st. He closed with the last exhibition at the end of December. He didn't have any time to make his own photographs, and no one was buying photographs. I mean, what are these people thinking? Both Willard and Jeanette and Mary Jeanette and Ansel. It is the depths of the Depression. Who's going to be buying fine art photographs? Turns out, no one. Group F.64 doesn't stop. They continue having exhibitions, teaching together, workshops, and from about 1934 onwards, who shows with them is Dorothea Lange. Dorothea moved to the Bay Area, and this is a photograph of her, a portrait by Edward in 1920. She married an artist that was quite respected, Maynard Dixon, a painter, and she opened, she'd had a good, strong photography background, and she opened a portrait studio. She was very successful with the wealthy and society people of San Francisco. Her name was discussed at that 1932 party to be a member of the group, and it was decided she hadn't come far enough, that was not enough there. And she, from then on, always said, and you'll look at all the books, a lot of the books about her, and they always said no, she never wanted to be a member, and she never was a member. Well, my research shows differently, and because she was in the shows. But the other thing is, there's this great letter that her husband, Maynard Dixon, sends to someone in the group, and it has enclosed with it a picture of his bare bottom, and it says, "This is what I think of Group F.64." So obviously they were hurt or, angered about the whole thing. But something happened with Dorothea, and I've always thought it could have been not getting into F.64, because F.64, the show's November, December, and either December, January of 32, 33, just right after that, she walks down the steps of her studio and out into the streets and first starts making the photographs she's so known for. This is White Angel Breadline, and this man is obviously beyond destitute. Glass of water? Pardon? Oh, thank you. It's such a change from a society portrait to doing this, and this becomes her life. Very soon she moves into 100% documentary photography, and really, in a way, the term documentary is started to use by Walker Evans in the East, but it starts to really, she seems to really define it. So you can see what's happening with F.64. It's not a dead movement. It starts in the beginning as being, the rules are this, you must do this. But by including right from the beginning, someone like Connie Kanaga, who's photographing African Americans, who by including then as she comes along Dorothea, it shakes things up and it keeps it alive, and it keeps it a movement of greater importance than if they would have been stagnant. And it's due a lot to the growth and understanding of Imogen, Ansel, and Willard. Edward would never go so far as to think Connie Kanaga made great prints, or he continued his straight and narrow path, and that was right for him. And they also invited Peter Stackpole, another East Bay photographer who was much younger and who became really well known being one of the first to use the 35 millimeter camera. And in the classes they taught, he would teach small camera. This is his building of the Oakland Bay Bridge, which was the milestone, and this work of his from that time is still being shown all over the place. Again, expanding what F.64 could be. Didn't have to be a view camera. So those, I knew so many of the members of the 13, plus the invited. I knew 7, most of them very, very well, those 7. I did not know 6, mostly because they were just a little bit too old for me. But I want you to know that it continued what they did. Ansel, in 1940, Ansel was one of the founders of the first department of photography in a museum, and that was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. That was one of the goals of F.64. Another goal was to start education and being able to get a degree in photography, which was always, if it was represented at all, was an adjunct to a fine university. So he was the first to start the program at San Francisco School of Fine Arts, today the San Francisco Art Institute. He started that in 45, 46 as veterans were coming back and taught many wonderful photographers. And in 1967, he founded the Friends of Photography, which my husband directed for a number of years, and as he called it, the latter-day f.64. So Ansel had a big deal of continuing what f.64 was into the future. I'd like to conclude tonight with just images by the group from the f.64 original show at the Young. And accompanying the images, well, Ansel originally was a classical pianist, and he wanted to be a performer, but I found only one review of the trio he put together, the Melanby Trio. That was Mildred on violin, Ansel on piano, and Vivian, the modern dancer. And it said that the pianist drowned out the violin and raced ahead of the dancer. So, this is true. So anyway, Ansel, this is a very rare recording, and we're playing it on a little boom box, but it's Bach's C major prelude. This is Ansel Adams. Edward Weston. Imogen Cunningham. Edward Weston. Sonia Skoviak. Ansel Adams. Peter Stackpole. Dorothea Lang. Self-portrait, Alma Levinson. Imogen Cunningham wrote, "Photography is a craft to which both sexes have equal rights. If photography needs any new recruits, it needs only people of good taste who have a sense of the limitations of the medium. And with this good taste should be combined the hand of a skilled mechanic, the eye of an artist, and the brains of a scientist." Ansel wrote a letter to dear Mr. Mortensen. "Mr. Mortensen, there will be salons of pure photography long after your creations are to be found only in collections of Photographia Curioso. How soon photography achieves the position of a great social and aesthetic instrument of expression depends on how soon you and your co-workers of shallow vision negotiate oblivion. Consuela Kanaga. From my photography, I have learned that poverty is a tender and terrible subject to be approached on one's knees. And Edward Weston. The camera should be used for a recording of life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself, whether it be polished steel or palpitating flesh. Thank you very much. I know it's probably long enough, so I don't want to hold people up, but.
We'll just do a very brief, maybe 3 questions.
Sure.
If you can just repeat the question.
Okay, all right. Yes?
In the early days of these folks' careers, and particularly during the Depression, how did they make money? Was it lucrative or at least sustainable for them? Did they have other sources?
The question is, how did these people make it financially how did they make enough money to survive during the Depression? Part of the reason they gathered together, they also thought that together they might get more attention and they might be able to sell more photographs. All the photographs in the f.64 de Young exhibition were for sale. There were price lists. Everybody's work was $10 a print, except for Edward was $15. Yeah, a time machine, right? They struggled. Ansel made a go of it because he worked hard all the time. He was not wealthy. He did marry his wife. His father-in-law had some money, and he helped keep them afloat, I think, until when he died in '36. They inherited his best studios in Yosemite, which is now Ansel Adams Gallery, and Virginia ran that, and she's the one who kept the kids fed more than Ansel did. Imogen, like I said, until Vanity Fair went under, was earning a good living as a commercial photographer. It was, Willard lived at home and didn't leave to go to New York, and immediately got a job when he went there. All of these people, none of them, well, Henry Swift, they were hoping, and he did buy their work, so that helped keep them a bit afloat. But most of the exhibitions are famous for never selling a print. The f.64 show at the de Young, 1 print sold, and it was by Preston, and who bought it was Lloyd Rollins. Lloyd Rollins bought from all of them eventually, and an exhibition of his collection was shown at the de Young, I think, in '34. So, it's not like they barely made it. Often it was because their spouse was working. Any other questions?
Do you think that the Young still has that collection?
They do not. And they didn't buy the collection. The collection went on to travel in different parts of it to, I think I have, and it's all in the book, but people for years have always said there was only one f.64 exhibition. I think I've got it up to 29. That's through 1940.
Is there a museum in Oakland that's housing Dorothea Lange's?
Yes, the Oakland Museum has their archive, and they are great about sharing that and getting it out to the public. Yeah, they're terrific.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm not quite clear, first of all, how many years did you work with Ansel? You wrote his autobiography. Did you do other things, or did you ever make prints of him?
I was smart enough when I used to photograph, but when I started working for Ansel, And between Jim, who's a great photographer, and Ansel, who's, you know, off the charts, I just knew that it's kind of like Ansel in music. I know that I was better at something else. And he hired me because I was fluent in photography, but I wasn't his photographic assistant. I was to write, and I was, you know, to edit. And again, I mean, I've got to just say, the very first day I started working for Ansel, he was working on this museum set, and he just finished printing Moonrise, which was the hardest negative he had to print. There was so much darkroom manipulation. And he told me I needed to go through the whole pile, and he taught me what he was looking for, and it was my duty to rip up the Moonrises that weren't good enough. And this is how, I mean, you know, I'm sorry, I wish I could get a higher level to tell you, but the honest truth was I was thinking the sale of one of those prints could, you know, support a family in India for feed kids forever and all that kind of stuff, because it was selling for quite a bit of money at that point. And so when lunchtime came and Ansel came out of the darkroom and he came to see me, he said, "You haven't torn up one?" I said, "No," and I just can't bring myself. And so right after lunch, he sat down with me again, and he said, "You know, this is really important to me. You are going to be the person standing between me and the future and posterity, and I have very high standards, and I do not want to continue prints going out there that don't meet my high standards. I can't check every print. It's up to you." So I'm just going to say the first chair was the hardest. But that's how I started, but I was hired to the autobiography. Autobiography is very much Ansel. Ansel would, especially in the first few years, this is how he wrote. He would write whatever would fit on one page of typing paper. That would cover any and all subjects, that amount of space. If he needed to say more, he would turn it on his margins. And, you know, so it was like, to tell you the truth, it was like putting together jigsaw puzzle, putting it all together, and I just wrote bridges in between that if they were really necessary. And then the big thing was going through the proofs. When Ansel died, he'd only selected one image. So I selected the other 249. And the one he selected, this doesn't sound good for how much I knew Ansel, was not the one I thought. It was to open up the Yosemite chapter, and so it should be the quintessential Yosemite picture. I just assumed it was going to be Clearing Winter Storm, but Ansel chose one of gray cliffs, gray granite, a very quiet print, not well known. And he said, I said, "Ansel, please explain this to me." And he said, "Because this was my first feeling as a child. When I came into Yosemite, I just looked up and it was just all these incredible granite cliffs." And for me, for Ansel, that's the essence of Yosemite, granite. So I tried to open my mind and hear him all the time.
Did you select his photos in the book also? A lot of his photos?
In the autobiography?
Isn't there another book just with his photos?
Oh, there are a lot of books. My last project for me and Ansel was the Book of Letters. And when I finished that in '88, it was time for me to go. And I felt like that was my last assignment from him. And since then, there's a trust that runs his publishing, and they are very active. They publish a different book a year. There's a lot of books out there, and they do a beautiful job on reproduction. So.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.